welcome back. In a world where we often feel stressed and overwhelmed, we often forget to take stock of our emotions like stress and anger. Joining us now is occupational therapist Amy Isaacs, who is here to help us unpack and nurture these emotions. Amy, you know, whenever I think of emotions, that Destiny's Child song comes to mind. It's just emotions taking me over. Yeah. We don't want these emotions to take us over. So how important is it, Amy, for us to take stock and acknowledge our feelings, especially that of stress and anger?
It's so important because they can change how we interact with the world, can change how we interact in our relationships, in our workplaces, even with how we interact with our children. Yeah. So it's important to acknowledge our feelings and not sort of run away from them or think of them as negative, but actually just to acknowledge where do they come from, and especially when it comes to anger, where does it come from? Why am I angry? And what can I do with that anger? Yeah.
And a lot of people, I mean, I feel like I'm getting better, but I used to be triggered by so many things, whether it's internal factors or external factors. What are some of those factors that do come into play when it comes to our stress and anger?
Yeah, I think using the word triggers is important. You know, what starts that feeling? And if you're thinking about being angry or irritable, we normally start to feel it inside, you know, like it's almost a bit bubbling in our stomachs. And it can be absolutely anything. It could be an external factor of load shedding, road rage, even just your child bringing a report or a project to you that's due tomorrow, but you haven't had the time to plan for it. And you'll just actually feel that frustration and anger picking up. There could also be internal things. It could be something that happened to you as a child or as something you experienced in earlier life, and something can remind you of it. Anger comes from a frustration when we feel an injustice or when we feel a threat. So if you're feeling any of those things, either from something that's happening to you that you can't possibly control, like load shedding, or from something that is happening to you that you maybe didn't heal from previously. That would be more of an internal factor. So it's important for us to figure out where is it coming from and what can we do with it once we know where it's coming from.
And you have already kind of touched base on some of the physical feelings and things and symptoms that might come up. What are some of those other physical and psychological things that come up when we are experiencing that anger and stress?
Yeah, I think let's talk about where it comes from. Yes. So when we're feeling stressed, the hormone cortisol is released in our brain and adrenaline is released in our body. Now, all of those are released to keep us safe, right? A little bit of stress is fine. If you've got a deadline or a project that's due and you've got a little bit of stress about it, that's fine. But when you're experiencing the stress over and over again, cortisol is consistently released in your brain and it puts you into a fight, flight, or freeze response. Anger might come from that fight response. It might even come from your freeze or your flight response, depending on how you as an individual respond to that level of stress. So you could, if in long term, that type of stress impacts our bodies in terms of body aches and pains. You might find that you have headaches consistently. You might have outbursts of anger, which actually really impact the people around you. And that could end up in being very vocal, very loud, very frustrated. It could even end up being aggressive and physically aggressive. And that's generally where people want to back off, because we don't want to deal with anybody who's physically aggressive or aggressive in any way. So we allow them to just stay in that anger by themselves. But anger comes through in multiple ways. If we're looking at just from an internal space, you might feel that you've got gut issues. You might feel, again, the headaches. Because when we are angry, we start sweating, right? And our breathing gets short. And we start getting frustrated and everything almost feels like it's getting smaller around us. And those are all responses from an increase in cortisol.
Why is it that different individuals experience stress and anger differently?
It all depends on how we were raised. You know, were we allowed to express our anger as children? If somebody took your toy as a child, were you told, no, we always share, even if you were really enjoying that toy? You know, have you always been told that your anger is not important? Or have you grown up in a space that says, I understand that you're angry, but we like to share here. Let this child play for 5 minutes and then you can have your toy back. You would have learned how to process your anger. But if you were never taught how to process your anger and frustrations, or you were just always told your emotions, sort of, you're not allowed to be emotional. And as women, we experience that a lot, you know. If we get angry, then suddenly we have a lot of other
we're bitter, all these words get thrown.
All of these words, where it's actually you've never been allowed to express that frustration in a healthy way.
Yes.
And even in a way that helps you understand yourself better. So it's a normal emotion. It's not a negative emotion. Anger actually is teaching us something about ourselves every time. And it's important that we take stock of that. What is anger trying to teach me? Am I feeling unjustified in this situation?
Unheard.
Unheard. Am I feeling unsafe? What about this situation is making me angry? And even if we look at something like load shedding, what about that load shedding start in 55 minutes? What about that is making you angry? Is it the injustice of it? Is it the fact that you're actually so overwhelmed and stressed by life that you don't have time for this? You cannot replan your life around it. Or is it a matter of actually, you might have someone with special needs at home? So it's important for us to take stock of how we respond to anger as individuals.
Amy, occupational therapist that you are, thank you so much for unpacking emotions, but more specifically stress and anger. However, we will continue this conversation a little bit later.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Now, what great insights, Mzansi. Later on, Amy joins us again to offer her expertise and insights into effective anger management. But for now, over to Dumi and Jay in the kitchen.